Welcome all. Welcome back to my asynchronous session. And in this week's workshop, I'll be discussing not two, but three current research issues in business. These three issues are namely the myth and mystery of business research, the impacts of globalization and deglobalization, and lastly, the pandemic impacts and recovery of supply chain. In another session, I have spoken about the mythifying and demystifying of business research. And the logic, validity, and reliability I've introduced through a triangle Venn diagram to discuss of the assertions in business research. The usefulness of scholarly work and their generated theories are sometimes being questioned. Okay. With journal titles containing phrases like "Does publish or perish lead to stylish rubbish?" Stobaka in 2014, or "The Triumph of Nonsense in Management Studies," written by Tourish in 2020, and non-replicable publications are cited more than replicable ones, published by Sarah Garcia and Sneezy in 2021. With titles like this, one may wonder what happened to the development of logic and the authentication of validity and reliability. If we just look at the bias in logic and reliability, okay, there's a biased primacy on theory creation over its practical usefulness. And essentially, what is found is that there is a biased trade-off by publication review panels who lower acceptance standards for interesting papers. And what is meant by interesting paper? There will be a paper which is able to garner public attention or media coverage. And if we look at the irrelevance or incompleteness of validity, which overlaps with logic and reliability, a lack of accuracy caused by vagueness in papers hinders the evaluation of test validity. Okay? When contextualizing, academics are sometimes guilty of making non-holistic or incomplete studies to achieve a controlled, selected set of variables for testing. And some editorial teams commence the journal review process prior to data collection and hence missed out on the opportunity to check on results. These missed opportunities or failures often lead to a lack of validation. And continuing on the failure that's observed impacting validity and reliability of business research. Sometimes in follow-up publications, not all results from the initial or original papers were being examined. And on average, only the first result from economics papers will be replicated in subsequent publications, even though that result may not be the main point of the study. And thus, this result in failure to validate results and to review exactly what was being measured in the first place. If you recall, in another session, workshop, I've touched on the paradigm shifts in global supply chain. We do know that e-commerce has been around since the early 2000s, and there is a shift from what I call supply chain management to demand chain management. Basically, it is a shift from the offering of goods, services, and products from a supplier driven point of view to a market driven point of view. So, in yesterday's model, it is mass production, mass marketing, and very much inventory promotions that are pushed by inventory based decisions and low cost production. In today or tomorrow's model, it is really uh, market driven, one to one marketing, which is information based, and there is a centricity or focus on customer value. Okay. And the third shift will be the cross border collaboration, which is amplified now in the pandemic situation, where we see there is a need for more uh, close cross-border collaboration, and also sometimes government intervention to keep borders open and movements of goods unencumbered in this period. It might be worthwhile to briefly speak on what Thomas Kuhn introduced in 1964, 1962, in this book on the scientific revolution, okay, where he introduced the resounding concept of paradigm shifts, which he described as a new representation of scientific evolution. Okay, a novel theoretical model must be invented when old theory can no longer explain a new phenomenon. Okay, the delivery and manifestation of novel theory evolved from the accumulation and assimilation of scholars committed to outdated and sometimes incompatible theories. However, one must realize that these discarded out of date theories, sometimes referred to as myths, may not necessarily be unscientific in principle. Generated by similar methods and processes, myths are held along the same reasoning lines to lead to novel scientific knowledge. And while exploring the paradigm shifts in supply chain and considering how the business world has changed, one must understand that the lack of interpretation or an agreed reduction to rules does not prevent a paradigm from guiding research. Okay. To my fellow social scientists and engineers, okay, we once observed the Newtonian theory of mass being conserved, right? And when studying nuclear fission or fusion, okay, when mass is actually not conserved but convertible with energy by Albert Einstein in his E equals to mc square law theory, okay, where energy is equals to mass of the radioactive element multiplied by the square of speed of light. Okay. Although there is a novel theory that has been developed, we must agree that in our identification of a paradigm, okay, we have to sometimes agree that a complete in a complete rationalization of the paradigm, right? A shifted paradigm do not necessarily mean that the outdated theories become suddenly unscientific. Okay, rather we should derive from the logical structure of existing scientific knowledge or on the new phenomena that now could not be explained or has not been observed before in order to disclose novel aspects of nature and their rationale. Let's move on and look at the impacts of on global supply chain through globalization and deglobalization. Okay. Um, Deglobalization forces signify the reversal of the impacts and outcomes of globalization. And I've highlighted the year 2016, which actually marks two significant events that have contributed to deglobalization. The first being the Brexit referendum in the UK, and the second was the election of Donald Trump as the 45th president of the United States, or POTUS. Okay. And his more often than not nationalist policy eluded a backlash against the underlying social and economic value of globalization. Okay. We must remember that a few months after the election, in January of 2017, Donald Trump signed an executive order and withdrew the US signature from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP trade deal, okay, which actually involved 12 nations, including US, Japan, Australia, Peru, Malaysia, Vietnam, New Zealand, Chile, Singapore, Canada, Mexico, and Brunei. And the goal of the TPP was to make it easier for businesses, okay, between these countries in the PAD to export and import goods by eliminating taxes and creating a fair regulatory environment and removing other trade barriers. Okay. I further postulate two more factors, which are the intensification of the trade war between China and US that is likely to speed up the deglobalization process, and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic could have also catalyzed or accelerated the deglobalization through the border closures and restrictions. And in this chart, in this figure, which I drawn from the World Bank data, showing the measures of world trade in a percentage, as a percentage of global GDP. Okay, the chart observed two dips or two troughs, and the largest trough, the largest dip, was in the period of 2008 and 2009. This is easily explained by the global financial crisis, which started in the year 2008, and the next dip in the chart can be observed in 2016, which coincidentally coincide with the year that I've identified the two significant deglobalization events in the year 2016. Next, we look at the third business issue that we are discussing today, which are the pandemic impacts on global supply chain and the recovery of businesses. Okay, according to Sherman in 2020, 94% of Fortune 1000 companies have been encountering pandemic supply chain disruption since the start of the global coronavirus outbreak. Okay, and I wish to examine what is the impact of the pandemic on e-commerce, which was a paradigm shift observed in global supply chains since the early 2000s. Okay, and drawing from this chart from KPMG Business Analytics, okay, coinciding with the mid of 2020, where globally we saw a pandemic at its peak, at its very peak. The year-on-year percentage growth of e-commerce, surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, coincide with this point in mid 2020 as the highest point in e-commerce sales. Okay. In fact, Contractor in 2021 argued that the business world will require even more globalization in the pandemic recovery phase, and he forecasted that the fundamental of rationale of international business will be guided or led by MNCs, leading the role of transnational bridging agents over the next decade. And contractor further predict that the ongoing digital transformation will play a lead reinvention role in most areas of the supply chain workflow. With that, I thank you for your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you at the next asynchronous session.